Bethany, a small village located a few kilometers from Jerusalem, was a peaceful place where life flowed simply. In that location, there lived a devout family known for their faith and hospitality. Martha, Mary, and their brother, Lazarus. They were very close to Jesus, who, throughout his journey, had created a special connection with that house. Whenever he passed through Bethany, Jesus found refuge, friendship, and affection there. Lazarus, a man respected by everyone in the village, was kind and admired by his neighbors. However, suddenly, a serious illness struck him. The illness, which initially seemed simple, soon worsened and fear took over the house. Martha and Mary, desperate in the face of their brother's rapidly declining health, saw no other hope than Jesus, the man in whom they placed all their trust. In the midst of their distress, they sent an urgent message to Jesus, who was some distance away, hoping that he would come quickly. The words that reached Jesus were simple and direct. "Lord, the one you love is sick." They knew that Jesus, full of compassion, would soon come, and their faith remained firm. However, as the days passed and Jesus did not appear, the concern grew, and Lazarus' life hung in the balance. Despite the urgency of the message, Jesus did not rush to leave. He received the call for help, but, surprisingly, remained where he was for another 2 days. In the eyes of his disciples, the delay was inexplicable, but Jesus knew that something bigger was underway. This illness is not for death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it, he said to those who accompanied him. Still, Martha and Maria in Bethany did not understand the reason for the delay. Lazarus' condition worsened every day. Martha, always practical, looked after her brother with all the care possible, while Mary, more contemplative, remained in constant prayer. Their faith, however, was beginning to be tested by the inevitable reality of the disease. And then, the moment they feared most arrived. Lazarus died. Mourning took over the house. The silence, interrupted only by the sobs of the sisters and the friends who came to comfort them, was heavy. Neighbors rallied to support Martha and Maria, and burial preparations were quickly made. Lazarus was placed in a tomb, a cave sealed by a large stone, as was the custom at the time. Although they were devastated, the sisters were still waiting for Jesus. He might not have arrived in time to heal their brother, but in their hearts they held a faint hope that his presence could bring some comfort or, perhaps, divine intervention beyond any expectation. However, the days passed, and Jesus still had not appeared. The questioning grew among those present. Why didn't he come? When Jesus finally approached Bethany, Martha was the first to hear the news that he was coming. Even in the midst of her grief, she did not hesitate. She quickly got up and went to meet Jesus before he entered the village. Martha's heart was heavy with grief, but her faith was not shattered. When she saw him, her words were direct and charged with emotion. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." There was pain in her voice, but also faith. Martha believed that if Jesus had arrived in time, Lazarus could have been healed. Yet, rather than an accusation, her words carried a firm belief that even now, he could do something. "But I also know that even now, whatever you ask of God, God will give you," she continued, expressing her confidence that Jesus' connection to the Father could change any circumstance. Jesus, looking at Martha with compassion, responded with a phrase that would change the course of that moment. "Your brother will rise again." Martha, still overcome with grief, interpreted the answer in a more distant spiritual context. "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." It was then that Jesus made one of the most powerful statements in the entire gospel. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? Martha, even with a heavy heart, responded with conviction. "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." With this statement, Martha's faith was strengthened. However, the suffering had not been erased. Her brother was still in the tomb, and there was still uncertainty about what was to come. After Martha's intense encounter with Jesus, she returned home and called Mary privately, saying, "The Master is here and is calling for you." Mary, who until then had stayed at home, consumed by grief, got up quickly upon hearing this. Without thinking twice, she went to where Jesus was, outside the village, in the same place where he had met Martha. As soon as Mary saw Jesus, she fell at his feet. Her pain was palpable, with tears streaming down her face. She repeated the same words that Martha had said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But unlike Martha, who faced her grief with more control, Mary gave herself completely to her grief, weeping at the feet of Jesus. She was deeply broken, and her tears expressed the anguish of an irreparable loss. The Jews who had come to comfort Mary followed her, and upon seeing her sadness, they too were moved. The pain of everyone present was almost tangible, enveloping the room in a heavy and suffocating atmosphere. When Jesus saw Mary and the others crying, he was also deeply moved. His compassion for those he loved was evident. It was then that Jesus, in a moment of full humanity, wept. The Son of God, faced with the pain of death and the suffering of his friends, let his tears flow. The scene was powerful and moving, showing how much he shared in human pain, despite his knowledge of the miracle that was to come. Some of those present commented, "See how he loved him," while others questioned, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying?" The tension between pain, compassion, and the expectation of a miracle hung in the air, while Jesus, still moved, made his way to the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus arrived at the place where Lazarus had been buried. The tomb was a cave, as was common at the time, with a large stone covering its entrance. The atmosphere was filled with silence, broken only by the weeping of friends and family, still inconsolable over the loss. Facing the cave, Jesus ordered in a firm voice, "Take away the stone." His words echoed among those present, who exchanged looks of disbelief. Martha, who until then had expressed her faith, hesitated for a moment. The weight of reality once again fell upon her, and her rational mind prevailed for an instant. "Lord, by this time he stinks, for he has been dead 4 days," she said, her voice trembling. To Martha, the decomposition of Lazarus' body seemed an insurmountable obstacle, something that even Jesus could not overcome. Jesus, however, looked at her with tenderness, but also with authority. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" he replied. It was a gentle but firm reminder that true faith must extend beyond the limits of human logic, into the realm of miracles. Martha fell silent, and those around her began to remove the heavy stone that sealed the tomb. The sound of the stone being rolled away echoed among those present, while the tension in the air grew. Everyone was in anticipation, but also in doubt. Could it be possible? What was about to happen? Death had already won, or so it seemed. As the tomb was opened, faith and unbelief stood side by side in the hearts of those watching. Then Jesus stood before the open tomb, looked up to heaven and prayed, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the sake of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." After the prayer, the crowd waited in silence, in a mixture of amazement and doubt, with their eyes fixed on Jesus. With the stone rolled away and the tomb opened, the silence that enveloped the scene seemed almost suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Jesus, waiting for what he would do next. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the crowd, including Martha and Mary, watched, their hearts torn between faith and despair. Then, with an authority that transcended death itself, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." His words cut through the air, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The people held their breath, waiting for something that defied human logic and comprehension. Inside the dark cave, something began to move. To everyone's amazement, Lazarus, still wrapped in burial cloths, emerged from the tomb. His feet and hands were bound by the cloths, and his face was covered with a cloth, as was the burial custom of the time. The sight of Lazarus, alive and standing, was incomprehensible to the crowd. Murmurs of shock, fear, and awe filled the audience. Some fell to their knees. Others wept with joy, while many simply watched in astonishment. Jesus calmly and authoritatively ordered, "Untie him and let him go." Those present, still stunned, rushed to Lazarus and began to remove his burial clothes, freeing him completely from the prison of death. The scene was one of pure amazement. That which had seemed to be final death had been reversed before their eyes. Jesus had shown that he had power over death itself. The impact of this moment was immediate and profound. Martha and Mary, who had shed so many tears of grief, now wept with joy. Their brother was back to life against all odds, and their faith had been rewarded in a miraculous way. The miracle of Lazarus' resurrection quickly spread throughout Bethany and beyond. The small village, which had previously been plunged into mourning and despair, was now the center of an explosion of emotion and amazement. The news that Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days, had been raised from the dead spread like wildfire. People from all over began to gather at the house of Martha and Mary, eager to see for themselves the one who had been raised from the dead. Many of the Jews who had come to comfort Lazarus' sisters witnessed the miracle and, deeply moved by the power of Jesus, believed in him. For them, there was no longer any doubt. Jesus was truly the Son of God, the promised Messiah, the only one capable of conquering even death. Faith spread quickly among those who witnessed the miracle, transforming mourning into celebration and despair into renewed hope. However, not everyone reacted in the same way. Some of those present, frightened or disturbed by what they had seen, immediately set out for Jerusalem. There they sought out the religious leaders to tell them what had happened. Upon hearing the report, the Pharisees and chief priests gathered, concerned about Jesus' growing popularity. This miracle was not only a demonstration of power, but also a threat to the status quo. The raising of Lazarus further solidified Jesus' status as a force to be reckoned with. So while many celebrated the miracle, a shadow of conspiracy began to emerge. The religious leaders began to plot more firmly to capture and eliminate Jesus, fearing that his growing power would lead to a revolt and intervention by the Roman authorities. The miracle of Lazarus, while bringing life, also hastened the events that would culminate in Jesus' crucifixion. With Lazarus now alive, Martha and Mary's home was once again a place of joy and gratitude. The sisters, once devastated by grief, were reunited with their lost brother, experiencing a miracle they could never have imagined. Their hearts were filled with gratitude for Jesus, who had not only comforted them, but had given them back Lazarus. Their faith, even in the face of death, had been gloriously rewarded. However, beyond the physical restoration of Lazarus, this miracle carried a deeper meaning. Jesus had not only raised their beloved friend from the dead, he had definitively revealed his power over death, offering a glimpse of the promise of eternal life to all who believe in him. His words to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life," echoed not only in Bethany, but in the hearts of all who witnessed or heard of the event. Jesus demonstrated that through faith, death is not the end, but a gateway to new life in God. As time went by, the resurrection of Lazarus became a symbol of the greater promise that Jesus carried with him, victory over death. It was a foretaste of what was to come, of his own resurrection, which would bring salvation to all humanity. Martha, Mary, and Lazarus lived as living witnesses to this power, and their stories influenced many who were searching for hope and spiritual renewal. However, the miracle also marked the beginning of Jesus' final days on earth. The religious leaders' plan to capture him was already underway, and the miracle of Lazarus, while bringing life and hope to some, also accelerated Jesus' path to the cross. But even this painful path was part of the divine purpose, where death would once again be defeated, this time definitively. Thus, the resurrection of Lazarus remained an eternal reminder that faith in Jesus transcends the limits of life and death, offering to all the promise of abundant and eternal life.